year in 2012, according to the EPA, carbon emissions have been reduced by 16%. Okay, funny thing happened for that reduction. Part of it was due to the fracking. Part of it was due to fracking, but most of it was due to the recession. During this time, we have not had an increase in carbon emission. We have not had an emission. We've not had a rise in global temperatures. So obviously, the solution that the present administration, both sides of the aisle, that don't tell you about it, is that controlling global warming involves a permanent recession. Follows as the night to day. Anyway, if someone has smarter comments than that, we'd be happy to hear.
The gentleman who just went last, you had a really nice slide there that showed the United States, and I tried grabbing a picture of it on my camera. Can you just go back on that presentation and show it? It's not the one.
Which one was it? Was it the one about energy production, or
the percentage of energy sources from coal broken down by state? And you had a nice color-coded graph.
Oh, okay. Well, you can. I don't know if this is working again. Okay. Yeah. Right. There it is. That one.
Yes.
Okay. Right. And that's on the Heritage website, by the way. Just look up David Kreutzer. That's from your study about what happens if we phase out coal, you know, in 20 years or whatever that was.
My question, if I can still ask that question, is the new 111D guidelines. That's they have a significantly different impact on a state-by-state basis. Where, for example, my home state requires a 41% reduction in the amount of CO2 per megawatt hour. Whereas places like North Dakota have an 11% reduction. I'm just wondering if you could highlight some of the inconsistencies in 111D and some foolishness that's in it. In less than 5 minutes.
Yeah, I wish I could. The thing is so Byzantine that it's almost impossible to figure out. What they are ultimately hoping is that all the states will get together, realizing how Byzantine it is, to have regional and I think ultimately nationwide agreements on trading permits for CO2 emissions. So we'll have a cap and trade program knitted together from state cap and trade programs. So I think what if you just look at what they've proposed, it's unworkable, but they're going to give, quote, flexibility to state legislators to raise their own revenue by selling emissions permits and trading them, which brings Wall Street into it as well. So.
Yeah, they're very cunning here, but I don't think they're going to get away with it. But basically what they're doing with the 11D rule is they're trying to have EPA enact everything in a substantive way, not in detail, that was in the Waxman-Markey cap and trade bill. Because there are no best available control technologies for reducing carbon dioxide emissions at the facility level. So they're basically saying, well, let's let the states have cap and trade and we'll approve that. Let's have the states adopt more renewable energy mandates and we'll approve that. Let's have the state implement more demand reduction programs. This was all in the Waxman-Markey cap and trade bill. And somehow magically that will average out to a 30% reduction in CO2 emissions by 2030 and so on. Just one other point is that they're selling this on the basis that there is at least $31 billion in climate benefits from this rule that will be realized in the year 2030. And maybe it's more, maybe it's 84 billion, depending on the assumptions. But this is all total nonsense because, as we just reviewed here, even if the United States shut down every CO2 emitting facility right now, you would have less than 0.2 of a degree Celsius change in global warming or global temperatures by 2100. So that means between now and 2030, there would be even less. And of course, their program calls for much less than total shutdown. So what impact would this really have on weather patterns, polar bear populations, heat-related mortality, even if they were right about the underlying science? Well, it would be infinitesimal. So how do you get $31 billion minimum, $90 billion at the high end? What you do is you take this completely made-up quantity called the social cost of carbon, you multiply it by the number of tons that would be reduced, and you say that's the benefit in 2030. But as David pointed out in one of his papers, the social cost of carbon is an estimate of the damages that would be done over a period of 300 years. Like it's Captain Kirk's great-grandchildren, right? It extends it out. And so somehow all of those hypothetical cumulative benefits by the year 2300 would all magically be available to us in the year 2030. I mean, it's that sophistical. It's just pure sophistry, and it doesn't even stand the laugh test once you start to pick it apart.
I noticed the effort by Hank Paulson, our former Secretary of Treasury, to promote a carbon tax to avoid what he calls a climate crash. I have no idea what he means by climate crash, but it's a new word and worth remembering. He wants a carbon tax immediately to avoid a climate crash, and he's supported by such worthies as Michael Bloomberg and Tom Steyer and George Shultz, who lends his name to these efforts. And now we are faced with a business risk. He's trying to enlist the business community in supporting a carbon tax. Would you comment on that? And tell us what a climate crash is all about.
Yeah, I would like to comment for a moment. The Paulson was peddling subprime mortgages right up to the crash. And his peddling subprime science. And it's made up. It's a made up term.
His friends on Wall Street lose money if they don't have something to trade. I guess. I don't know. Yeah, I can't get my mic to come on. But it's a great new word, and as Ken pointed out, Hank Paulson's the last person we should trust to see the incipient crash of anything. So.
Okay, questions back here.
The federal establishment is a big supporter of the man-caused global warming scam. You see the same thing with the academic community and, of course, the national media. But anecdotally, I get the feeling, and I'm from the Middle West, that this massive propaganda campaign has not necessarily sold the average Joe Blow, the middle class, the working class, and so forth. And the occasional surveys that I've seen that appear buried below the fold line seem to support that on a national basis. Where do you think the disconnect is operating here? Why is it, despite this massive propaganda campaign, that they haven't made their case with the American people yet?
Well, the polls I've seen show that the vast majority of people think that climate change is a problem and we should do something about it. And then if the next question is, would you be willing to pay a nickel per gallon in gasoline for it, they say no. So we should do something about it, so long as it's presented as the president does present it, free. That is, no, it's not going to have an economic impact. It's going to create jobs. We're going to get richer. Everybody's going to have a job with a white lab coat, and we're all going to be scientists, engineers, and so on. Nobody's going to have to dig anything. And that's, we had a panel at Heritage a few years ago where we had economists from all across the spectrum. We had economists from the liberal Brookings Institution. We had economists from the Congressional Budget Office. We had economists from the Energy Information Administration. And one other that I can't remember right now. There was none of them said when we restrict carbon emissions, the economy will get stronger. The entire debate was how much will it shrink. But Washington's been very clever. The activists have just keep pushing it over and over. I do these debates on TV, and they keep repeating the same lie, that regulation creates jobs and subsidies create jobs, because they point to the ones, yes, there were some people working at Solyndra until it crashed. You can create jobs by taking money from one person and giving it to another. You can make that other person richer, but the economy in total shrinks. So I think the disconnect is when people want to think they can get something for nothing. When you say, well, what if it actually costs you something? Then then they say, okay, let me look at that again. I had a former colleague, both of us did, Ben Lieberman. He said it was like when I went to get my first car. The guy said, do you want rust proofing? Do you want paint protection? Yeah. And they said, well, the rust proofing would be $7. I said, whoa, wait a minute. I don't see cars rusting that much. Let's skip that. The paint seems to stick on pretty well. I don't think I need that. So when it starts to cost somebody something, they start to look at it and then they say, no, thank you. That's my version of it.
I'd also say about that there's a lot of duplicity on the part of the other side. For example, in 2012, Obama actually ran to the right of Romney on energy. He accused Romney of being anti-coal. Obama didn't campaign for greenhouse gas regulations or carbon taxes or cap and trade in 2012. But now that he's in, he's going to he's ordering his EPA to basically enact all these policies or variants of them without the policy having to be vetted and approved by the people's representatives. So this is, to a great extent, the reason why some people seem to be so hot to trot about this is because it's a power grab for them. And it also allows, and especially because it allows them to bypass the separation of powers. I would argue that what EPA is doing is an affront to the Constitution. But hey, if you really want, as Mel Brooks once said, it is good to be the king.
Hi, I'm from the California legislature. First and foremost, thank you so much for all of your comments. As many of you know, California has a cap and trade program in place. Our first cap and trade auction occurred in November of 2012. The program covers 85% of the economy, and roughly 600 of our largest entities, our business entities, are subject to the cap and trade program. One of the things that's interesting to me is this idea that there's going to be policymakers who have some benign use of the funding. In other words, they want to use it for good instead of for their own pet projects. But as we've seen just in this past budget session, that roughly 25% of our cap and trade funding is now going for our state's high-speed rail project.
Work.
So I do have a question. I think the biggest atrocity of this is the regressive nature of a carbon price. So could you talk a little bit more about which think tanks are actively involved in quantifying what the regressive impacts of these policies will be going forward on low-income and middle-class communities?
No, I mean,
You guys have done it.
Yeah, we've run the numbers, and we occasionally point out that the percent of a poor person's income that goes to energy is higher than for the wealthier. But that's actually a good question. I'm embarrassed to say I can't point to a whole bunch of studies that's split out the impact on lower income. Sorry. You?
No, but I will note that on this idea of this grand bargain that you can use carbon tax to trade away all these obnoxious regulations, I think it was the leader of the Assembly, of the Senate in California, actually proposed this. Hey, let's allow the Climate Solutions Act to be complied with through a carbon tax rather than cap and trade. Oh no, we can't do that. So much for this grand bargain.
Thanks so much for your presentations. I'm Ken Gregory from the Friends of Science Society in Calgary. The IPCC uses 3 integrated assessment models to estimate the social cost of carbon. And of course, we know that they don't include any benefits of warming or CO2 enhancement. But on the social cost of carbon, there are 3 main categories that they assign costs. The health impact of warming, sea level rise and extreme weather events. And I'm wondering if, I don't think any of you three addressed this issue, can you tell me in these assessment models about what fraction between those three categories do they split out the social cost of carbon?
First of all, the integrated assessment models, as you pointed out, are based upon the ICC models, and they're failing. To try to do an assessment of failure is a failure. Now, the three integrated assessment models that I've looked at all disagree. The one by Richard Toll, who is not an avid global warmer, but is part of the ICC process, says there won't be any damage for about 80 years, until about 2080. The others are different. They use different discount rates. A discount rate is how much do you value a future dollar today? If you use a discount rate of, say, 10%, a future dollar is worth 90% of today of what it would be worth a year from now. The official discount rate is published by the General Accounting Office that is being used for the United States government is 7%. David, you can correct me if I'm wrong on that. The ones that are being used by the EPA are a variety of 2.5 to 5%. That makes the future damage much more important today than it will be than it is if you use a higher discount rate.
Yeah. We've actually run two of those three integrated assessment models that the EPA uses to come up with their social cost of carbon. The third one is called the PAGE model by Chris Hope, who insists on the right of co-authorship of anybody that publishes anything using his model. And we said, sorry, we're not going to do that. He asked us if, when we published our results using the others, he said, well, are you going to do this for mine? And I said, well, you're going to release us from, the rights of co-authorship, because otherwise it's not independent. But in any event, I think it's very difficult to assign which fractions of the social cost of carbon are due to the different categories. If you look at Chris Hope's model, and this is published, and it was a slide I didn't get to, I'm sorry, in a paper frequently called the Cost of Doing Nothing paper from the Natural Resources Defense Council, on page 23, so this is a 2009 publication, Frank Ackerman was the lead author. On page 23, halfway down the right-hand side, he explains, here is the loss function. It's not split up in all the different ways that they talk about in the first 22 pages. It's simply a simple loss function. It is A, some coefficient, times the temperature change between the base year and whatever year you're going to have all the increased temperature, raised to the nth power. This next sentence, after he describes this, he says, there is essentially no literature bearing on what n should be. He was the guy who worked in the Stern Review. And so they made up a number, and it didn't scare people enough, so they doubled it. The core of these integrated assessment models is the loss function, and they're arbitrary. And so it doesn't matter. And they don't bother. They make a little bit. Well, here's something that happens in agriculture. Here's that. And here's the other thing. And then they have sort of fudge factor. We think, well, it's not getting a high enough number. Let's add something.
Yeah, if I could just follow up on that quickly. The social cost of carbon is voodoo. It's hocus pocus. Because what they do is they feed into these computer models non-validated climate parameters like climate sensitivity, and then these made-up damage functions. I mean, a damage function basically is a technology assessment. It's a projection of how able we will be to adapt to climate change in the future. Well, it means you have to predict what technology is going to be in the future. How do we know what technology is going to be when Captain Kirk's great-great-great-grandchildren are alive? And then they fiddle with discount rates. So they can, by manipulating those inputs, they can get just about any result that they want. And so I think the takeaway on social cost of carbon is that it's computer-aided sophistry. It's designed to establish two notions in the public mind. One is that fossil fuels, no matter how cheap, are unaffordable, and that renewable energy, no matter how uncompetitive and uneconomic, is a bargain at any price. That's real. And so Chris Hope, that David was referring to, he's now saying that the social cost of carbon is $260 a ton, which of course would mean that it would make economic sense to completely replace all fossil electric power generation in the United States with solar panels and wind turbines, and try running a modern economy on those two energy sources. You know, we'll have a depression the likes of which the world has never seen.
Can I put a plug in 5 seconds? At the follow-up after this conference is over, I don't know if any of you are going to Freedom Fest, but I will be giving a presentation on the social cost of carbon in those models.
It's 2 minutes after 11 o'clock, and I notice that a lot of you still have questions. Still a half an hour before we have to give up this room. But, you know, if you want to do other things, it's a good time to leave. But if you want to continue to engage the speakers, I think you should come up here and talk with them and do that. One point about the California and the Regional Greenhouse Gas Institute in the Northeast states is that both of these trading schemes have a denial of property right status to the allowances and the credits, which means that the government has a carte blanche to change the rules and to target emission reductions anytime it wants, and the people that suffer damages from that changes in the rules cannot be compensated under the Fifth Amendment of the Constitutions for takings. Thank you so much for asking terrific questions, and thank you, the panelists, for having terrific answers too.